Violinist Zina Schiff was very young when she met American composer William Grant Still, kicking off a lifelong love of his music, which she shares with her daughter, Conductor Avlana Eisenberg. I'm Colleen Phelps. In this look behind the playlist, Zina Schiff and Avlana Eisenberg honor William Grant Still's legacy of family love.
I wanted to start with what feels like a really obvious question after reading the album description. Zina, what was William Grant Still like when you met him?
I had a child impression of him because I met him when I was so young, but he impressed me as a gentle man who loved children because he used to come to the Merrill Bloom's Orchestra, the California Junior Symphony, the Youth Symphony, where I played in Los Angeles since the age of 6. He was a regular visitor there and seemed to really enjoy watching the children and seeing their progress and encouraging them. And at the time, I actually didn't realize he was a composer. He was strikingly handsome, and I thought he was a movie star. And so only years later, when the producer, Dana Paul Perna, sent me his music for my first American album, and he sent various things for me to look at. And I saw the music, fell in love with it, and said, of course, I want to include it. And in fact, it's called Here's One, which is one of Still's pieces on the album. I researched him and found that, and I saw his picture and recognized him right away. So my impressions, again, he seemed so lovely. He came up to me after my first performance with the orchestra in a Vivaldi concerto, and I remember him bending down and shaking my hand and looking me straight in the eye and telling me to keep practicing. And that was a lovely compliment. And I read so much about him now. And so my initial impressions, I think, were correct.
That's a long time between meeting him and this album release. Tell us about sort of the genesis of this project.
Well, it started with that other album, Here's One. And that was 6 tracks of his violin piano works. And I knew that some of the works he had written were with orchestra. And it's taken a while, but here we are.
Avlana, you might have a little different approach not having met him. How has your relationship with Still's music been up to now?
Well, the earliest exposure that I can remember was in the mid-90s when Zina was preparing this All-American album. And Here's One has remained one of my favorites of her albums. And there are many that I adore. And once it became clear that there were orchestrations of these pieces, not only a few of the ones that she had recorded on the Here's One album, but also some of the longer pieces, which we of course include on this CD, Pastorella and the Violin Suite. And also once it became clear that these had not been recorded in their orchestral versions, the idea of an all still album that would be all orchestral and feature the solo violin works with full orchestra, including 2 of the works that Zina recorded in Here's One, came to fruition as an idea. I was thrilled to get to learn these additional pieces, many of which showed up in the original manuscript, so in Still's hand.
There's really something for everyone in this album. There is planes and airmen, there's trains and model trains. There's a dog, which is a delight to hear about. How much did both of you spend time engaging with the inspiration behind the pieces, since it's so picturesque?
I guess I'll jump in. It's so easy to understand what Still is depicting. And in a way, I think it so enriched the process of learning the music and also conveying to the ensemble what was going on. I mean, in the short piece about Still's dog, you hear someone pulling on a leash and the dog doesn't want to go in that direction. It's so vivid. And in the Violin Suite, where each movement is inspired by a piece of visual art of Still's contemporaries, you can see those portraits, the bronze bust. And so I felt like I could draw on that inspiration throughout, because I think Still does such a masterful job of depicting these scenes, whether it's California or whether it's a statue of an African dancer.
Zina, I especially wanted to ask you that about the violin suite and the pieces that are inspired by visual art. How much time did you spend sort of engaging with the visual art?
Well, I had some very interesting experiences with it. The first was flying down to Tallahassee, and I was in Jacksonville, and my husband was giving a lecture at a medical center there, and I had the afternoon to browse around, and a walking distance from the bed and breakfast was the Cummer Museum, and I went in there, and I literally bumped into Gammon. They have a replica there. And I was in New York at the Whitney Museum and paid a visit to African Dancer. And it's, when you get off the elevator on the 7th floor, there she is. And it's just astounding to see. And Mother and Child, I have only seen a copy of. Actually, it's on the music, but that's at the MoMA in San Francisco. But I love learning about the whole context of these works. And I also paid a visit to New York on a different trip more recently. I think it was 3 years ago, just prior to COVID. And I went to an exhibit at the Jewish Museum in New York, and they had an exhibit on a woman, Edith Halpert, who owned the Downtown Gallery. And she exhibited all of these works in an exhibition that was the first African-American centered exhibit in New York. And she helped get these pieces into big museums and big collections. And all of these works were there. And they were based on Alain Locke's book, The Negro in Art. And he was a big supporter of William Grant Still. He championed his work, and they were part of the Harlem Renaissance. And Edith Halpert went with Locke to see an exhibit, and as a result of it, she showcased this. And that's how I learned about it in so many different ways. And it was so gratifying to see this.
One of these inspirations is not like the others on the album. It feels like Jean Sibelius as the subject for a piece by William Grant Still is kind of unexpected. Avlana, what do you think the connection that Still felt to Sibelius enough to write a piece in his memory was?
Yeah, so this I think is one of the most dramatic and poignant works on the album. And one thing I've thought a lot about this, and I think there are a few different things one could imagine. One thing that really resonated with me is the extent to which both composers are so rooted in their natural surroundings and their place and their nation. And I think that that's one thing that's still very much shared with Sibelius. One of the other pieces on the album, Pastorella, he describes in the score as a tone picture of California. And as a California native, as is Zina, I think you can hear these elements that he's drawing from these natural surroundings, which of course is something that Sibelius does throughout his work. So I think that's one dimension that does unite them. And this love for country and this desire to showcase it in its multifaceted beauty.
I think that love for country is something that the more of Still's music I hear and the more I read about it, beyond a love for the country and optimism about the country, does that really come through in his music for you as well?
It absolutely does. And it's quite remarkable when we think about his place in history and all of the struggles that he faced. He wrote the song that was showcased in the World's Fair in New York in 1939. It was on a continuous loop playing throughout the World's Fair, and yet still was only allowed to attend on so-called Negro Day or with police protection. So it's quite remarkable given what he faced, both that he managed to break so many barriers and remained hopeful. And I think all of his works, you hear some of the optimism, you hear a range of moods, and that's something else that I love about his work, is just how broad it is emotionally. But I do think that there is this hopefulness and this optimism that really does transcend his work.
Beyond that, I think highlighting the excellence of the artists around him was a big theme, and plus love for his family. Zina, having played his works for so long, are there any other sort of running themes from the music of William Grant Still that you want to see people really get from his music?
Just that it's from his heart. And it goes to the heart. I just heard somebody today who was not a music lover at all, and just they said, oh, where can I get this? I love this. This is really beautiful. It speaks because it's so personal and it's so down to earth. And I think that optimism. And I think that's why he loved children. He had hopes for the future and a better world. And it's all there. It's just an appreciation. It's a gratitude. He signed every score in gratitude to God.
I have to ask, doing a project together as mother and daughter like this, and I know it's not your first thing together, some people would think, oh yeah, I could easily do this with a parent. And some people would think, oh gosh, the idea of working together like that. What's that like?
Well, I can unequivocally say it's a feeling of being so incredibly supported. I mean, since my earliest memories of music, my mother has been my musical inspiration. Now, I should say, it did not work very well for her to be my violin teacher. There were limits and boundaries. However, standing up in front of the orchestra with her by my side, I literally feel like my musical inspiration is there with me, and it is a seamless collaboration. I have learned so much from her, both about her interpretation of these works and just music generally, how to study music, how to think about approaching a score each time as though for the first time, and connecting with players, connecting with audiences. She has been my strongest and my best teacher on each of these levels. So it's a true joy, and I look forward to many more projects.
Zina, I'm assuming, like William Grant Still, there's a big sense of family pride there.
Yes, there's a huge one. And Avlana has just been there. I mean, I was performing with her while I was pregnant. She's been there with me all along, and knowing what to do. I have such confidence in her. And so having her there was, at the recording, it was the best thing. It was the ultimate, really. I couldn't wish for anything better, and I hope to do more with it.
Avlana Eisenberg leads the Royal Scottish National Orchestra with violinist Zina Schiff in a new album of William Grant Still's music, available wherever you listen to music. You'll also hear it on 90.5 WUOL Classical Louisville.